This is the MeatEater podcast coming at you shirtless, severely bug-bitten, and in my case, underwearless.
We hunt the MeatEater podcast.
You can't predict anything.
The MeatEater podcast is brought to you by First Light. Whether you're checking trail cams, hanging deer stands, or scouting for elk, First Light has performance apparel to support every hunter in every environment. Check it out at firstlight.com. FIRSTLITE.com. Holy cow, big-time author Peter Stark is here. Old friend, too. New York Times best-selling author, longtime contributor to Outside. Like, at a time, Peter and I both contributed at Outside around the same time. Peter is a, like an adventure, an exploration writer. How else would you put it?
Well, now I call myself an adventure historian because I write about other people doing the crazy stuff because I'm too old to do it myself. So I look for historical figures that have gone over the edge in the wilderness.
Well, it went too far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than myself or rather than you.
At a time, you would push it a little bit too far yourself.
Right.
And then now you let other people do the pushing.
Right. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. You've done some pushing yourself.
Sure. Longtime contributor to Outside Magazine. His work has appeared all over the place. He's written for the Smithsonian, New York Times Magazine, written for the New Yorker, written how many books? A lot of books.
7 or 8 now.
7 or 8 books. Yeah. We're going to get into some of these books, which are highly applicable. Peter Stark wrote a book years ago about just all the worst ways to die in the wild. He's written a book about Astor and the Astorians, so kind of like a mountain man beaver trade book. America's first homegrown millionaire.
That is right. Visionary.
A visionary. He wrote a book about, and this touches on. So in a way, you're touching on some of me and Randall's territory.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, this is your world.
Yeah. Well, we're looking at more of the working class end of things, and not the bosses. But you've touched on the boss. So we're working on the thing about beaver trappers.
Okay.
And he was sort of the boss of the beaver trappers.
Yeah. Yeah. You worked for him, and he told you what you were going to get for that pelt.
Yep.
And you were kind of a captive man under John Jacob Astor.
And then he became big time rich.
He became big time rich, yeah.
And if you go into Astor Place, the subway station in New York, today, you will find
a beaver on the wall.
In the tile work.
Really?
I've gone and looked at that.
Yeah. It's really cool.
There's a beaver in the tile work at Astor Place.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I've been in that subway station a million times. Never noticed it.
Also wrote a book about... Man, you have a new book. This is brushing up against our boy Clay, but also wrote a book about George Washington, but the early George Washington, and the surprising amount of like wilderness experience George Washington had as an explorer and bushwhacker and
kind of a general screw up in a lot of ways, which was really shaped his career because it was like he made all the mistakes he could make in his 20s in the wilderness. And, like inadvertently setting off the French and Indian War, almost freezing to death. I mean, within an inch of dying at age 21. And one thing after the other out in the Ohio wilderness. Mm-hmm. And then he managed to learn some things from that experience. And he became a great leader eventually. But at this point, he was just kind of a jerk, actually. He was very self-centered. He was really thin-skinned. He was incredibly ambitious. He was in love with his best friend's wife.
Oh,
he wanted to be British.
Lied about chopping a cherry tree down.
And he wanted to be British. Literally. He tried for years to be a British Royal Army officer, and they wouldn't let him in. And he was really angry about that. He tried for years. There are lots of stories about that.
Now, we were having trouble with George Washington because we just did a audio bit about... So we're doing these projects on different phases of commercial hunters. Okay. So the first one we did was on the deer hide hunters, mostly in the first Far West. So, stuff that flowed into the Ohio, mostly from the South. It's like Daniel Boone.
Okay,
guys like that.
Okay,
deer hide hunters, pre-revolution.
Yes. Okay.
So our book our audio project covers up to 1776. Okay.
Because that's cool stuff. Yeah.
That world kind of dissolved, but in it, there's some really alarming quotes from George Washington, who had like a very like condescending, just shitty attitude toward the backwoodsmen
Oh yeah.
of the frontier, and questioned their patriotism.
Well,
In that he's like, a tip of the hat would push them to the French. And he says they're not. Was he bitching that they weren't Brits or they weren't Americans?
Just that they weren't quite invested in the revolutionary project, and that that they didn't have any fierce loyalty one way or the other. They're sort of people in between empires.
well, now here's George Washington out in the Ohio Valley wilderness, and you're talking 1776. In 1770, he took a canoe trip down the Ohio River, and essentially he reserved 20,000 acres of the very best lands for himself. Literally.
I'd like to
And
get that. I'd like to get a hunting
he served
permission off him, man.
and the reason he could is because he had served as an officer, Virginia colonial officer in the French and Indian War. And, that's how he got paid. The officers and men got paid in bounty lands, you know that expression, free land for your service. And as an officer, he got 3,000 acres as an officer in the French and Indian War. And then what he started doing is he went around secretly to his fellow officers, but he wouldn't go himself. He'd send like a surrogate and say to the fellow officer, hey, you interested in selling that 3,000 acres? And if the fellow officer might say, yeah, I'll sell it. And so then George would buy it. And that in that way, he accumulated like 20,000 acres of land. And then he went over the mountains and canoed down the Ohio River in 2 big canoes with Indian guides, and he had some frontier guys with him. And he staked all the rich bottomlands, and he keeps a journal of it all the way down. So that's 1770. Then in 1774, things start heating up with a revolution coming along, or tension, a lot of tension between the American colonists and the British. And there's a certain point where the British in London, the British in charge in London say, those bounty lands that we were going to give to these American colonists for their service in the French and Indian War, well, actually, those bounty lands are only going to go to British officers, not Virginia colonial officers. He went apeshit.
That's what
there are these letters. I've got some, I think, reproduced in this book. But he was so angry, and that was 1774. Didn't take him much to push him over the edge to the
that was probably the point. Yeah, that was probably the point at which he got his revolutionary fervor, man. Also, a book which we're going to get into about the great leader Tecumseh.
Exactly,
and you pit him against.
William Henry Harrison, territorial governor.
And when I say that you pulled in on our boy Clay, is in our network there's a podcast called Bear Grease, and Clay did I think a 3-parter on Tecumseh, which was interesting, but didn't delve into the sort of this
kind of face-off between the two.
This sort of face-off between him and the president of the United States.
And the dynamics, it was really the dynamics between the white world and the white political world and the native leadership. And really interesting. And Thomas Jefferson, my hero, does not come off well in this equation.
Really?
Yeah. We can get into that.
Down all the founding fathers, man.
But once their earlier days, they're not all saints.
Yeah.
They're great guys. There's no doubt about it. And they're great leaders. A lot of them, they all.
Yeah, but they're forged by fire.
But forged by fire. But there was a lot of self-interest going on there at the same time.
No.
You've never seen that in politics.
You know what? So we're gonna get into all that real big time. You know what I've been watching with my boy that's like well worth time, my littlest boy, is have you guys seen that thing? It's like Planet Earth, but it's dinosaurs.
Phil, maybe you know.
No idea.
It's called Prehistoric Planet.
My kids have watched. I don't know if it's the same one. I feel like there's a lot of those.
So instead of them, it's got that same guy. That guy that does all those things, Attenborough. Oh my good Lord! I mean, God bless him. God bless him. But holy cow, they got a part of it where you actually see him talking, and it's like he physically has to sort of like expel his words. His head's like, the hunter becomes the hunted. Oh, it wears me out. Drives my kid.
Your next show.
Oh, it drives my kids crazy because I'm like the whole time I'm sitting, I'm like. But what they do in this thing. So they got a lot of these dinosaurs. Let me tell you about dinosaurs. They got a lot of these dinosaurs. You find like part of a bone, right? The best you can do, like I'm all for it. We had the Jack Horner on, not in this studio, but our old studio. I'm warm to dinosaurs. But you got like a dinosaur, you find like a hunk of his toe, which is great. What this thing does is it totally tries to make up their lives. So rather than it being a show about here's what its little chunk of its toe looked like, and if you figure that his toe looked like this, and its foot might have looked like this, if its foot looked like that, one might assume that, right, whatever. Mm-hmm. They get into like, it's all CGI.
Yeah,
and there's one of them making a nest. And then another one of them comes up to like rob the nest, but a snake gets it.
Yep. And they make up like mating rituals.
Oh, they got all their vocalizations, and every dinosaur is constantly vocalizing.
Yep.
A dinosaur will be sneaking up. He's sneaking up on something. And he's vocalizing. They don't stop vocalizing. Every dinosaur, all the time, in every scene, is vocalizing. They even got it where like there's dinosaurs that use tools. So he'll get a stick lit like a cigarette and run over and light some stuff on fire to flush game out. There's a dinosaur that goes on a beach and he makes like this artwork on the beach to attract a overhead mate, and he lays out like an offering of
like an SOS.
Do they write books too?
Wait,
well, this is all bird behavior. Right, so that's what they're.
Yeah.
Come on.
They take some
No,
real.
I mean, I totally get. I mean, it's bullshit because we can't possibly know.
But
that's
with
what
a
they're
kid-
extrapolating from is bird behavior.
Like current bird behavior.
I get
bird
it.
behavior,
And they got a thing, the science behind the show, and they got a thing. But when you're watching with a 9-year-old, I can't help myself. I have to pause it and be like, "Now you understand."
Oh yeah,
you sound like a blast.
He like in his
you
mind,
ruin it for everyone.
in his
is what
mind,
you're
they
saying.
somehow have filmed. In his mind, they've filmed dinosaurs.
Man, you're like ruining the Santa Claus story.
Oh yeah. He's like, "Oh, it's great." And they even do this stuff where it's like they even do parts of it in night vision. So you'll be like dinosaurs in a hole in the ground and it's infrared. Then I'll pause and be like, "Now you realize." Yeah.
I think this is very important for you to do because I think it's very dangerous. Right? Because we talk with
film a
people of
watch
different
along with
faiths
Steve.
often that are like, well, and you're like, okay. And you gotta be able to explain certain things to certain people.
We watch a little every night, man. It's fascinating, and parts of it I need to. Yeah, the Attenborough stuff kills me a little bit. God bless him. He's been in the biz a long time. The guesswork, but here's the biggest thing that blows my mind, and I don't think this is guesswork. Dinosaurs in the snow.
And the hair they have on them.
I had it in my head. I don't know. The whole damn place is a jungle. But there was a lot of dinosaur activity in the snow
In this show.
But they kind of lay the case out like the poles. The landmass moved, but I mean the poles were still cold.
They still stay. They were,
and they had
They
had like long, dark. Of course, at that time you had long periods of light and dark, just like we do now, right? So in areas that you had northern areas that were inhabited by dinosaurs that had total darkness in the winter, total daylight in the summer, had snowfall. And so there's a lot of this fake footage of dinosaurs duking it out in the snow, which is just not something you think about.
Yeah, here's a Smithsonian Mag article, as you've written for the Smithsonian, from 2020. How dinosaurs thrived in the snow. Discoveries made in the past decades help show how many species cope with cold temperatures near both poles.
Oh, that's
So I guess
okay.
it's
it's fascinating.
That's total news to
Wow.
But Attenborough, man, he lays in more with them one-liners. The hunter becomes the hunted.
You do got to tell the boys about firehawks, though, because in
I'm
Australia,
sure that's what. Yeah,
because that's
what they're going
badass.
off. That's what they're
super
going
cool.
off of. They're taking things that they know birds do, and just sort of randomly assigning them.
Yeah.
Now, there's one more gripe I got with the show.
You got to point out the fact too. It's like you can't make something like this and not have fighting.
A lot of
Right?
fighting.
It's like the dinosaurs spent a lot of time fighting.
They
each
mostly
other,
duked it
okay?
out.
Yeah.
See, now I find the firehawk less impressive if
Knowing that it's been going on for this long.
yeah, 65 million years and they haven't advanced beyond the right.
Well, they fly.
Yeah, but the trickery, the tools, the culture.
Oh, come on, Randall.
I don't know.
Yeah, Randall changes off. He used to use a diaper. Look how much he's advanced just in his own life.
From diaper to doctor.
So,
Back to diaper
Oh
someday.
yeah, I don't know if you know, he's PhD. You're sitting next
Is
to.
that
over
right?
there, yeah. In history.
I told
Okay,
you that
now,
earlier.
now I'm scared.
Randall's has been looking at you with a condescending eye. the
Yeah,
whole
well, you should be.
Yeah.
Well, one more thing about it. There's a lot of like, so you know the flying reptiles back then, the pterodactyls and all that? There's one of those things as tall as a giraffe. Okay.
Does it have a long neck like a giraffe?
And they got them all walking around on their elbows. So they land and then they bring their wings in. Their wingtips are sticking up in the air and they walk on all fours.
That sounds like the dragons.
And they got these huge, they got these huge necks and heads. And I don't care. Like I'll say this right in the face of a paleontologist. I don't know what they look like. They didn't look like that. They didn't. Like you got it wrong, because physics still existed. Do you know what I mean? Like the physical properties.
Like gravity, stuff like that.
Yeah. Like unless you're gonna come and show me this sort of like shit that like what's his name? Einstein was into.
Yeah.
Was somehow not applicable. Because I'm like, that didn't look like that. You got that one wrong.
I think we need to watch this.
Yeah.
I think we need to watch this. Throw it up on the screen and
You know, there are some podcasts that do like sort of movie watch along commentaries where you
Yeah.
press play on the movie and press play on the podcast, and then you have people like, you know, it's like a commentary on a DVD or whatever.
New idea.
It's just Steve just pointing out all of the inaccuracies.
Yeah, with
of
my
a
kids
film
there.
with your kids.
Yeah, it's like he's riffing on the whole thing.
my kids going, Dad.
Yeah, Mystery Science Theater, right?
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
Podcast
That would be
concept.
so fun. I mean, it would be obnoxious as hell, but I'd love it.
I get to do that a lot. News from sort of commentary from Catalina Island. Going back to episode 488, we discussed the proposal by the Catalina Conservancy to eradicate non-native black-tailed deer, mule deer from Catalina Island. They'd come up with a plan. So Catalina Island is offshore. Well, it's an island off the coast of California, and they got a herd of buffalo that were brought out there for a western. I think it was a Zane Grey when they shot a Zane Grey new movie, and they got deer that they brought out there. The buffalo are okay to hang out. The deer they want gone, and so they're hiring. There's a proposal to bring in contractors to wipe the deer out from helicopters. We were discussing it on the show, and we were saying, you know, as I often do, why would you pay someone to go get something that people would pay to go get? And we discussed this. Is why not increase or use the hunting permit process that's already in place, and just expand the hunting permit process. They've been giving out 200 tags a year for deer in 2018, 2019. A guy who's been retired from California Department of Fish and Wildlife for 3 years wrote in with some commentary about this, and I'm kind of going through his commentary. He says in 2018, 2019, we increased that amount to 500 tags in an attempt to promote hunting to reduce the numbers on the island. California's Fish and Game Department went and encouraged the Catalina Conservancy to work with hunting conservation non-governmental organizations to recruit hunters to go out on the island. It's a long letter, but basically he says that the Conservancy is paying lip service. There's a term for this that I don't want to use on air because try to limit the curse words. To grin, it's my favorite thing. You'd say, if you tell someone something and they kind of grin and go, but they have no intention of doing it, they're grin effing you. Right? They're like, they're like, oh, we'll look into it.
That's what people have been doing to me all my life, but I didn't know there was a term for it.
You're like, hey, why don't you try? So basically that the Catalina, him saying, when we discussed this many episodes ago, we talked about there are a lot of obstacles to conducting effective deer hunts on the island, financial and otherwise. He goes on to say, he had tried extensively to work with the Conservancy to overcome those hurdles. And they did not take them seriously.
Well, they were the ones that made the hurdles, really,
Yeah.
is what it amounts to.
And then now with the helicopter plan, they've got a plan like many things where no one is happy. The helicopter plan has the animal rights organizations up in arms. It has the hunters up in arms. And you've gotten a thing where in trying to please everybody, you've pissed off everybody. And he says that, and he is not, this individual is not on board with the idea that the hunting plan just didn't work. Did I do a fair job?
Yeah, that's great.
It was never really given a chance to work.
He's got a great point in here too about like unsubstantiated claims about the difficulty of hunting in the wild land parts of the island. It's an island. It's completely accessible by water at all points. In fact, there's many different services out there so you can circumnavigate the entire island in kayaks.
Really?
Yeah.
God, that'd be a fun one.
Super cool. Super cool. And then you do that during lobster season. There's lobsters all over that island. All sorts of good stuff to eat.
Man.
And so I always think about that because I had multiple people tell me, like, oh yeah, there's no water. There's no, it's like, well, how the hell do these other people, it's a big island to go paddle around.
How big is it?
I've been out there. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I can't remember how many acres it is.
Like how many miles long?
It's like the kind of island I feel like you could drive around. I don't want to say. It feels like
very limited
Cal will
roads.
You can kind of take it all in with a view.
Depending on how closely you follow the shoreline, it's 52 to 66 miles to circumnavigate. 22-mile long island, 8 miles across.
So that's substantial. There's got to be water on that island.
There is. It's just it's very limited. And then like ice, right, is very limited, and then the roads, so like boats. But I've been out there more than enough times to dream up exactly how I would hunt that thing very successfully. It doesn't seem to be a real
not a problem.
Doesn't seem to really stump a fella.
Speaking of being able to take in, how I said you can take it in a view from a distance. So we some episodes ago had the director Werner Herzog on the podcast.
Oh my God.
One thing I didn't ask Herzog about that I wish I would have is he has a movie called The Enigma of Casper Mansker. And it's about a boy who was just raised in a little rock hut. They never let him, they kept him captive his whole life in a rock hut. No interaction with anybody. Later, he was freed and educated a little bit, but it had developed this very peculiar worldview from having been deprived and kept locked up in a rock hut his whole life. Someone mentioned him one time that you were in such a small space, but now you have the whole world. And he expressed that he viewed that space as being huge because everywhere he looked, no matter what direction he looked, there it was. But when you're outside and you look, a thing is only in one place. Do you follow me?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting perspective. Well, I mean, it makes logical sense. You can see how a human brain could configure it that way if there was no other reference point.
It's everywhere. Now, when Stephenson was traveling with the Eskimo of the high Arctic, and they would look through his telescope, they would refer to what they were seeing in the telescope in a future tense.
Okay.
Because that's when you would get there.
That makes sense.
Right.
What you would get to tomorrow, they would discuss as though it's existing in a future state as when you'd arrive.
So it's like a visual future tense in the language.
Like, well, we're not there now.
But there will be a mountain. There will be a creek.
Yeah, it'll be a time when we get there. And he would get frustrated because when they would draw maps of islands for him, and the features that they utilized heavy would be huge. So let's say there's a huge island with a small bay where they hunt waterfowl. They would draw it for him, but it'd be like a little island mostly consumed by a bay. Because in their head, like, well, who cares? Like, go to the bay.
Right.
It makes a lot of sense.
Way back when I was doing lots of spot and stalk mule deer hunting, you spend a lot of time just face down as flat as you can get, right? Like, especially in that like final 100 yards. And sometimes it'd be hours of just trying to creep that last little bit. And when you would stand up eventually, there would be like a little instance of like nausea or vertigo, and your brain like recalibrating to the scale of things as a standing human with a much further line of sight. Whereas like, you know, that multiflora rose stuff out on the prairie that's like 8 inches tall, you'd be like, it'd be like a giant boulder you're hiding behind. Kind of like similar like to like diving down on reefs where you're like, oh, there's a little tiny rock down there, and then you get down there, it's like the size of a VW type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that was always pretty wild to me.
I can totally imagine that. You're like in an ant perspective.
Yeah, and you're hyper-focused.
And you're hyper-focused, and then, you know, and there's all sorts of things, you know, we have 2 eyes that do the triangulating with your vision, and they've been triangulating 6 inches away, and now they're triangulating 6 miles away, and they say, well, there's something's wrong here.
Yeah, but that was always wild to me.
One of someone that got away, he died before we ever got him on. I always want to have Barry Lopez come on the show. And in Arctic Dreams, he's talking about a botanist who was working on a tussock. So cataloging all the plant species on a tussock and trimming it, which is like this little head-sized clump of vegetation, and spending, you know, I don't know what it was, better part of a day working on this tussock, like snipping, weighing, and then having this feeling of then standing up. And as far as the eye could see in any direction was tussocks. And it's sort of like the enormity, right? The enormity of the place.
It's like your stone hut.
Yeah. Or that's a Dr. Seuss trick, right? Where it's like the Horton Hears a Who type of thing. Like everything's on the head of a pin.
Here's a letter that I like this. We were talking about, I like this kind of letter because it's a letter that someone wrote in mad about something, but it winds up they're wrong. The subject is a serious issue with Steve not giving attention to something he's always bitched about.
Corinne, you should have titled this Steve's Wet Dream.
He calls himself, so it's Logan, the Mountaineer Trapper. And he says, y'all are always bitching about national parks because you can't hunt on them. And he goes on to say, well, how come you haven't acknowledged the latest entry into the national parks system, which is the New River Gorge of West Virginia? And he goes on to say, it's the only national park where you are allowed to fish, hunt, and trap within park boundaries. 70,000 acres of hunting, fishing, and trapping ground now entrusted with national park protections and then some. Quote, I'm amazed that none of you have acknowledged the, quote, thing that you dislike the most in regards to the other designations. Brody went on to say, "Pfft."
Yeah, I mean, look, it's great that you can do that stuff in New River Gorge. It's fantastic, right?
Mhm.
But fishing, you can fish in national parks all over the damn place.
Yeah, you can fish in Yellowstone. of all.
And it ain't the first national park you can hunt in.
But I pointed out to Brody there's a difference because if you get like Wrangell
Yeah.
St. Elias National Park and Preserve,
Hard park and soft park.
yeah, so in certain gates of the Arctic, there's a thing called hard park and soft park.
Yep. Preserves and
Mhm.
parks.
Yeah,
But a lot of it's in
Corinne gets a kick out of that.
Yeah.
Hard
Yeah,
park and soft park.
a lot of what we're talking about is in Alaska.
Yeah, where there'll be like an area of the park you can hunt and an
Right.
area of the park you can't. And I've even heard of people. I remember one time, I can't remember. I met someone who knew someone. They were out in the middle of nowhere, but they had killed a sheep on the wrong side of a ridge.
Right.
And they were like, they killed a sheep in the hard park, not the soft
Yeah.
park. And there was a little bit of brouhaha about that.
But yeah, there's other stuff too. There's national seashores, which would be like soft park, I suppose, where you can hunt. But in Grand Teton National Park, you can hunt cow elk in certain parts of the park at certain times of the year. So sorry, New River Gorge.
Sounds like Brody's turning into a national park apologist.
No, I'm not. But you know, you got to point out.
I mean,
that-
I'd consider myself a park man.
You're a park man?
I'm a park man.
No, I'm not.
I like to go look at large creatures that walk right up to you.
It's almost breaking up my marriage.
Mm.
My wife wants to go to Glacier so damn bad.
Well, Randall's marriage, they're very much
You should
aligned
take my wife to Glacier.
on
I'd be happy to.
the line at which they would become pro-capital punishment, if not pro-vigilante. And it's based off of their national parks experience.
Oh.
Just
Pray
enforcing rules.
Yes, but you guys were talking about killing people who broke the rules in national parks.
Randall thinks you
I'm
should.
gonna have to be reminded
Randall
of
thinks
a-
you should death penalty people who break park rules.
Randall, you should be a
We're
ranger in a
we're
national park.
This is probably an offhand comment fueled by some sort of substance that leaves one prone to exaggerating their feelings.
Well,
about
if
something.
that was the case, then I have a dear friend that wouldn't be with us anymore. Because when he grew up here, and when he was a boy, you would ride your horse into the park with a hacksaw because burls, like elk burls, was real popular for belt buckles. And they knew you weren't supposed to take the antlers off the park, but who really cared about the end? So that was a common thing in high school, is to ride around hacksawing off just the end because, like, come on, was their attitude? Come on,
There's still
you need the whole
I
you need
will-
the whole antler here.
I will say that there are the flagrant disregard for the norms of society that you see at national parks frustrates me and raises my blood pressure. When there's like a big sign that says "Don't walk out onto the alpine,"
Yeah.
and then someone just walks out onto the alpine.
Yeah,
and,
what
and
would we
starts-
do without Pierce Brosnan?
Yeah, why did Pierce Brosnan get in trouble in the park?
Well, he walked out towards the hot mammoth, the geothermal features.
Was he in pursuit of a criminal mastermind?
Well, he took a no. He there was a photo taken of him, and he posted it. And someone said, "What you're doing in that photo is against the rules." And
Well,
so
it
got-
could have been his last walk too. I mean,
It could have been.
Yes,
that there
there-
are places in Yellowstone where you, as you know,
Yeah,
you walk out there and suddenly the crust breaks and you're in like a lobster boil.
Yeah. Well,
Well, I don't want to wish ill on the brother.
Look,
but I
if
mean,
they
that'd
just
have
got
made the news.
if they just got rid of all the rules, all the idiots would be dead anyway. Randall, right?
yeah. Well, I don't know. I national parks, I think, are a source of great frustration for me, but I also see what they have to offer in terms of wildlife and landscapes. And
Yeah, I just don't like going anywhere where I don't feel like I'm scouting. Do you know what I mean? I can justify anything by feeling like maybe I'll see something that'll guide my future activities. When I'm in the park, I'm like, there's nothing I can see here that's going to influence anything for me.
Have you ever gone in the deep in the Yellowstone backcountry?
We're on the edge of it.
But like like in the center of the park. I mean, that's what I hear about.
That's where you go hunting?
Yeah, that's even worse.
That's where I run my trap line.
Going into those places is
And,
even worse, though.
Yellowstone beaver pelt is worth a lot of money.
Yeah, just genuine Yellowstone Park beaver pelt.
Yeah, I went in a thoroughfare.
Peter's slogan is rarer than hen's teeth.
I went
I'm
in a
joking.
thoroughfare once, and I was just like, man, can't hunt any of this. Really sucks, you know.
Did you get way back in there? And
Yeah,
what
it was
was
a
it?
long time ago. It was like in the mid '90s. But
To answer your question, I
went
have not. Yeah, I have not gone.
But I mean, just not in terms of hunting, but just in terms of, scout. When you're saying scout, you mean scout for some living thing.
like I'm doing something that might impact some
you
future
drew a
hunting
tag,
activity.
so- Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah, be
Okay,
like,
I got it.
Whatever. I don't know. A friend of mine just went on a pack riff trap. One of our buddies, he was pack rafting, and he casually mentioned seeing a couple bears. Now I took note. And I was like, now where again? But if he was pack rafting in the park, it would have just been in one ear and out the other.
I know. I understand that. I understand that.
Here's the thing I shouldn't even be talking about because we haven't looked into it at all, but just I'll point this out. Maybe Cal, maybe you've read up on this. Someone wrote in. I have not vetted this. Maybe we shouldn't even talk about it.
No, it's
You vetted it?
yeah. I mean, there's several other examples too. So
This is a real mental tongue twister here. I live in Minnesota. This is someone writing in. I live in Minnesota, and earlier this year, the Upper Sioux Agency State Park, consisting of about 2 square miles, was transferred to the Upper Sioux community. This land has a troubled history where the federal government failed to provide promised food annuities, and as a result, Dakota people starved. He goes on. This legislative session in the state Senate, a bill was introduced which would transfer state lands in White Earth State Forest, consisting of approximately 155,000 acres, or just under 250 square miles, to the White Earth tribe of northwestern Minnesota. The land currently is a state forest in the public trust and is used for outdoor recreation by the public for small and large game hunting, horseback riding, fishing, etc. Leaders of the White Earth tribe have stated that they would keep lands open to the public. However, the sort of guarantee that being a state forest has to the public would be lost, and ultimately access for the public to the land would be up to the whims of tribal leaders. While I think the land transfer is a noble attempt towards righting wrongs of the past, I do not agree with removing lands from public use to further this goal. Currently, the land is open to use for everyone, but transferring it threatens that common use. For this session, the bill has been tabled, but Senator Kunish, I don't know how he pronounces his name, who carried the bill, has stated she expects it to reappear in future sessions. I would appreciate any consideration on the topic and some of the MeatEater team's thoughts on this topic. I'll hit you with mine, and I'm going to keep it brief. I don't like to see under any circumstances, anywhere, public lands falling out of the public trust ever. Ever. I don't care what it's for.
yeah, but this could potentially. I mean, I agree. I'm like staunch public lands advocate and want to keep them open to everybody. But just by like saying that, it kind of leans into this assumption that access is going to change and it's going to come out of public access or not provide the same level of public access. All this is saying is that management would change. And that would be like the only known right now.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it does. With any management change, people like to rearrange stuff and let folks know who's in charge. So we don't know what we don't know.
Mm-hmm. That's why I hesitated to even bring it up.
I know. But yeah, I just saw over in the Black Hills a nonprofit Cheyenne youth group just purchased 40 acres in the Black Hills.
Mm-hmm.
As
off the open market.
Off the open market as an example of another example of like a land back situation where this is going to be like tribal land.
Mm-hmm.
in theory held in perpetuity,
but purchased off
off the open market.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
and then like Vermont and Maine have several examples of that too. So
Yeah.
Are you okay with that if it's on the open market?
Oh, yeah,
I mean, if it's
willing
private land.
seller, willing buyer.
yeah,
dude.
I mean, it's I mean, there's plenty of people who aren't, and it's a really fun conversation to have because it's like, well, what is illegal about? What is wrong about this?
And then
You could buy
also
it.
what goes against, that's an issue with the very controversial American Prairie Reserve in the north central part of this state, which is buying ranches on the open market, right? Ranch comes up for sale, you join the bidding process and you buy it, and what they would like to do is just take the infrastructure out, take the fencing out, with a long-term goal of turning it into sort of like a pre-contact prairie ecosystem. And people that would be very much private property rights, right, have a very don't tread on me attitude in general politically, will find it very offensive. Because it sort of transcends the property rights issue and gets into a removal of history.
Or it's a cultural threat, I think.
Yeah.
A threat to that ranching culture is my understanding. I mean, I'm not an expert in this.
Yeah, it's very much of like these coastal elites coming in here and buying up, and
but it's
changing our way of life.
conflicted by I understand that, but at the same time, I understand that I feel like if you'd gone to ask someone, like, do you feel that you should be able to do on your land what you want to do on your land? They would be like, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
So it's like, okay, then you sort of need to extend that outward, unless you're saying that certain things trump, unless you're admitting that certain cultural things trump one's right to do what one wants with one's land.
Right.
Well, by that argument, I mean, this is where I get impatient with a certain mindset that we see a lot in Montana when people say, well, I'm a fourth generation Montana or a fourth generation ranch or a fourth generation this or fifth generation that. And then, then you got the people who are 300th generation and 500th generation. Yep. And so you've got these guys who are fourth generation farmers or ranchers saying, well, this is our cultural history, and yet it ignores this incredibly 10, 15,000 years of other history. Mm-hmm. And so, what's the difference there? And with the point about is it the White National Forest in
White Earth.
Minnesota, White Earth, White Earth.
Yep.
That's another. It strikes me that's another irony in that
state forest, but yeah,
state forest, and I totally agree that I'm never for closing public access to anything. I mean that I'm staunch as can be, but it's funny with it's kind of a big irony that now it's the we'll just call them the white guys who are worried that the tribes are going to break the treaty.
yeah, and it's worth
and won't let them on the land.
Yeah, I'd be like, we're losing all of our land to these people.
It's worth pointing out too, right, that if you look in Minnesota on state forest land, like there's plenty of threats to public access.
On state forest.
On state forest. And it's in open pit copper sulfide mines, a giant helium deposit, all sorts of things that state land is typically there to generate some sort of income, right?
And that's part of its mission in a way.
Yes.
And that's a certain kind of public access, which actually cuts out part of the public because it's being made into a for-profit resource.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and then so like United Property Owners in Montana would be one of the groups that has tried to back legislation that would restrict APR from purchasing land or following through with their business model. The legislation's real wonky because it is willing buyer, willing seller situations. So I was thinking the other day, I'm like, would Sherman Antitrust Act be the way to it? You have a corporate entity that's gobbling up the resources.
Having undue influence.
Right. Would that be the way? This is just just
Yeah,
thinking out there.
you're gaining a regional land monopoly.
Right.
Oh, that's sweet. Yeah,
Of
that's
the
interesting.
right.
Okay, I've got another one along those lines that's really been kind of eating away at me. And
Okay, this is
kind
on
of
your, this is on. We're supposed to switch to you, so you're on your time now. You can do whatever you want.
Okay, well,
do whatever you want now.
This is how you'd like to use it. Go ahead.
well, I'll make it about me.
You sure you want to go to the bathroom right now? Okay.
No, so this will feed into what I'm doing.
Great.
I grew up in Wisconsin, came from a huge canoeing family, and so my grandfather was way into rivers, my father, on and on and on. My father was also really into frontier history and Indians. And so I grew up steeped in that frontier history. And one summer, my brother and I, we grew up on a lake. My mom still lives there, 92, in Wisconsin.
Really? Wow.
And yeah, doing well. I'm going to go back there next week. And we took a canoe from my parents' front lawn, and we paddled from there to New Orleans.
Really?
Yeah. Without getting out of the water.
I feel like I maybe knew about this, but then forgot it because it's somewhat, No kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. And so
I just were able to load right up in the yard.
My buddies and I talked about that a lot, but we never pulled it off.
Yeah, well, believe me, it's not like a summer vacation.
Yeah.
Because it's like punching in at the factory and doing 8 hours or 10 of hard paddling. And then coming to a sandbar.
So what was the basic, walk me through the basic, here to here to here to here.
Okay, so this is where I'm getting into the public access thing. So this is, do you know about subcontinental divides?
Yeah.
And so this is the subcontinental divide between the Great Lakes system and the Mississippi Gulf of Mexico system.
Yep. Which was punctured by the Chicago Sanitation Canal.
You are so right. We're going to talk about that.
Okay.
Chicago Sanitation.
Which was violated by the Chicago Sanitation Canal, which has the electric fish barrier on it.
Well, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, because I've been writing so much in these books. This most recent one, Gallop Toward the Sun, about Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison. And a lot of it takes place in that whole Midwest region in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes. And so I've always been really cognizant of rivers, my whole life, and how they flow. And that one of the most important geographical features in North America is that mid-continental divide between where the waters flow out the Great Lakes to the Gulf, to the St. Lawrence and into the Atlantic, and where they flow from down the Mississippi or down the Ohio into the Gulf of Mexico. So if you're an Indian or family, Indian birch bark canoe, you could travel all over the place without really getting out of your canoe, which they did. And people today don't really understand what an interconnected system of waterways there was, and there is in this continent if you have the right craft and you know where to go. So
and the benefits, right? Like the safety.
The safety of
being out on the open water with a lot of distance between you and thick brush, potential death from animals and people and all that stuff.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is safe. It's safety. And so one of the things that makes me crazy about public access is stream access law. And I'm sure you guys have discussed this in Montana.
Yeah, sure.
And I think
right now New Mexico is kind of the battleground.
Is where it's going on. And I'm sure you've talked about, at least as far as I know, we still have it. Montana's a really good stream access. Phenomenal.
Yeah.
That the high water mark is, you can venture up to the high water mark, which can be a lot of ground. But then I was thinking, there's this really important portage in Wisconsin that was, it was like the main interstate interchange of this whole part of North America. And it's between the Wisconsin River and the Fox River. So it's Green Bay. These are all voyageurs.
Oh, so it's a portage to get from the Mississippi system to the St. Lawrence system.
Yes.
Basically from the shit that goes in the Atlantic to the stuff that goes into the Gulf of Mexico.
And you know where Green Bay, Wisconsin is.
Yeah.
And which was it was a major Indian village forever, and then it was a really early fur post.
Who was the dude that got into Green Bay and put on a silk, what they call a Mandarin robe?
Oh yes, I know.
He's like China.
No, it was one of the French guys. It was Nicolay or one of those guys. Yeah, I'm in China.
Cross Lake, Michigan. He's like, here I am,
Here we
boys.
are.
Get my silk robe.
But then, so there's this, and my father would tell me about this. Okay, it's called Portage, Wisconsin, and and it connects those two.
Yeah, you know what's so funny? I've seen that and said that a million times and never thought.
And you never thought, yeah, because you grew up not so far away, and there's a big interstate that goes right by it, and so my brother and I was out there ski racing with my brother this winter at a ski area right near Portage, and after we finished skiing, I said, hey, I've always wondered really what this looks like, and so we started driving around, and this Portage, it's like a marsh. And it's not very long to get from one system to the other. So this summer we're going to go and make that portage.
Oh.
And what I'm wondering is like, okay, now in stream access law, okay, here we are on one of the central routes across the continent in pre-contact time. I mean, 15-lane highway, this portage would be. And now, can you actually go across it? And is it public land or is it private land? And if it's private land, are you allowed to go across? So what's your take on that?
No.
What? No, you can't, or yes, you can.
No, listen, I feel that, I feel like you should.
Yeah.
But follow the rules.
Seems sticky.
But if you should.
I'll send you first.
What is your intent? Right, that's what we talk a lot
He's
about.
trying to exercise his historic portage rights.
I'm going to work to establish those.
You're not intending to loiter on private land. You're not intending to harvest from private land.
No, it's straight, just a pass through.
Yeah, when some guy comes out in his yard and yells at you, and you say, "I'm trying to get from the Atlantic waterway to the Gulf, just leave me be."
And that guy goes back to mowing his lawn.
Yeah, I know a lot of guys who've done this.
Yeah.
But parts of it are, when I was really looking at it, it's like parts of it are still marsh. It's like you might be waiting. You might not even be in like
what is the from when you leave a substantial piece of water, how many miles you got to go to get to another substantial piece of water?
It might be a few hundred yards.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
Oh. Have you started mapping it out on X?
I'm about to, though.
Just
I'm
look at the
planning on
land
doing
ownership.
this in July.
I love it.
Oh, that's a great idea.
I'll send you a video. if
You can
want.
write about it, obviously.
Yeah, and I have another guy who might be interested in doing it with me. My brother wants to do it. You don't want a whole herd of you going through there. I'd keep it tight. No, we want to establish a precedent.
Yeah, do it like the Voyagers. Have about 60 of you.
Yeah. Well, and everybody has 180 pounds of beaver pelts on
Just
their back.
do it like you know what you're
They
doing.
can't stop you then. It's interstate commerce, right?
Exactly.
Okay, because you got to exercise the Commerce Clause.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating idea, man. Like, what happened? I think you should call your article. What happened to the old portage anyway?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you could find the last record of someone really
actually did
using it in that
That's
way.
a great idea, man.
It was a canal. It eventually was made into a little canal.
Oh, it was?
And then that was abandoned. But I think from what I can see, the canal is still there. I mean, you might even just be able to go take the canal. It's sort of choked up with deadfall.
God, that's fascinating.
There
man.
is new legislation in
I'll
Illinois
invite you guys along when we do it.
for stream access, revamping stream access, I think in Indiana as well. So, I mean, the stuff is still very much being tinkered with.
You're saying it's up now and being kicked around?
Yep, for sure. Because like there's plenty of historic use.
That's Indiana. I mean,
Yeah.
this is where this Tecumseh book takes place. That place is like rife with major passageways that people know nothing about today. And it was like this huge travel system through there. Fort Wayne, the reason Fort Wayne is where it is because it sits on, it's not like a mountain. It's this low knob. It's sort of like a ridge line. This is like your country. A ridge line, very subtle, stretching south of Lake Erie, and through that kind of northern Northern Ohio, Indiana, and to some degree Illinois. And the rivers that go north of that flow off that knob, go into the Great Lakes, and those that go south of it go into the Ohio River system, and then the Mississippi and the Gulf. And I mean, these, you could probably jump from one stream to another in a lot of these places. And so those were when Tecumseh, and his forebearers, the Shawnee and the Miami, were establishing villages, that ridge was one of the primary places where they established the villages. And when the U.S. under George Washington first, he was like in office about a year, said that the Shawnee and the Cherokee are hurting our settlers who are supposedly on legally taken land, which they were not. And George Washington says, "Okay, we got to go get the Shawnee and the Miami who are killing settlers." And so he sent an expedition right to that spot, Callaghan it was called, to destroy those villages. It was the epicenter. But it's so Indiana. It's really interesting that there's so many waterways in Indiana that were used very extensively by Native people.
And I'm like a river person.
Okay.
Love floating, love spending my time on rivers. And you never hear Indiana as like this place to go travel. No, it's not a canoe destination, of which there's many canoe destinations. But I do a lot of traveling and just yakking with people about natural resources and stuff. And more often than not, when I point out a river and I'm like, holy shit, that looks cool. You ever go float that? You ever go fish that? People are, nope.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that wild? Isn't that wild? Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
I have that same experience.
Yeah.
Hey, let me interrupt because we're gonna do two things. We're gonna speed date. We're gonna speed date with Peter's books and his body work. But Cal had an update for us. Then we're gonna go into our speed dating mode with Peter's books.
Is this the plug for the week in review?
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Phil, you chime in here. I think they're going pretty well, but we added a new drop every week to the week in review, and typically it's getting to know an issue or a conservation group a little bit better, a little more in depth versus taking the whole 22 and a half minutes that we do every Sunday for the news. How do you think that's going, Phil?
I think it's going great. Yeah. So if you guys haven't been paying attention to Cal's Week in Review, he's been doing 2 drops a week for the last, month now or so, and it's going to keep going. And just some really more in-depth conversations with these groups, and I think it's been going really well. I don't know what the feedback has been, but I assume it's been positive.
Yeah, all positive.
Great. No, if you dig the kind of stuff that we talk about a lot of times up top in the show, about certain little issues, conservation issues that flare up around the country, this is where you go to get to get greater level of information, a deeper dive on such issues and organizations that kind of drive those issues.
Yeah, so the one most recent to when this show airs spoke with a regional Pheasants Forever coordinator, Hunter Van Donsel, who's a wonderful human, very smart dude, smart enough to live on the High Line in Montana even. So he's got freedoms that we don't enjoy here in the Gallatin Valley.
Don't ruin it.
And,
extra wind.
Yeah, and extra wind. All the wind you can handle. And we talked about how Pheasants Forever operates, what they have going on, and then last year we spoke a lot about the grasslands, which would be like a NACA for grasslands, which national. What are my acronym there, Randall?
Are you talking about the North American Grasslands Act?
Yes, which would be a NAGA.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, would be a new updated version of a bill, which would be something that would affect us nationally.
We have for wetlands.
That would operate on the same system as our National Wetlands Conservation Act, which would be providing lots of private and public funding and additional resources for the conservation of grasslands, which grasslands is a big catch-all word of sagebrush steppes and mixed grass prairie and short grass prairie and lots of stuff that big gnarly mule deer bucks and antelope bucks and bees and migratory birds and a lot of fun things that we like to chase and check out. Grasslands are going away at an alarming rate, so that's why we're going to start working and talking a lot about the National Grasslands Act.
Well, it's all these organizations that we're throwing money at during trivia, but you could actually get to meet the humans behind these organizations, where their priorities lie, where the challenges lie, where they're spending this money, and how they're helping you out. So it's been going great, I think. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, and this is like one of the pet peeves that I have of the Ask Cal email. Is when people write in, they say, hey, tell me what to think about this. And so this is another pound my head against the wall example of trying to give you the information that you can make a decision on your own.
I would never give up that.
I was going to say a lot of people want that power. They're envious of you.
Peter. Okay. What was I can't
We're
remember now.
speed dating or speed reading?
Speed dating your books.
Okay.
So you're what's that French word? Your ouvroir.
Ooh. I think that's an omelet.
So
Or egg.
What was your first book? Sudden. What the hell was it?
Last breath.
Last breath. I was going to say sudden breath, sudden death. Last
Well,
breath.
kind of, yeah.
But that was your first book.
Yeah.
Tell people about your first book. This is fascinating.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's kind of like got me into this world. Well, I was in this world. Both Steve and I were doing articles for Outside. I'd started somewhat earlier, and Outside would, love it if you'd put your life at risk and then survive and write a good article about it. But that was sort of their oof, and at least in part. And so at one point, I came up with this crazy idea, kind of like this portage idea, and I said, well, I wonder what happens if you get in a car and in Missoula and at our little apartment above Goldsmith's Ice Cream when I was living with Amy, we were young marrieds, and drive north on Highway 93. And you just keep driving north on Highway 93 and you don't stop. And you cross the border and you still go. And then you still go. And then you still go. And like, how far north could you go? And then I started thinking, I wonder if you just kept pushing, if there'd be some way you could ever get to Greenland just by going north out of Missoula on Highway 93. So my father-in-law, who is
I see you're really into where one takes off from. And my father-in-law, who is a foreign correspondent, great adventure, had a VW van. He said, "Okay, yeah, let's take my VW van." He was going to drive us up as far as we could get, and then Amy and I thought, okay, then we'll start trying to look for planes or whatever we can find. And so we spent like 6 days driving from Missoula up through due north, and we got up to the Northwest Territories, and essentially Highway 93 ends in Yellowknife. And you guys have probably been there. Yeah.
Okay. Big lake, very big lake. And then my father said, "Okay, I'll take the van." And then we started hopping like small kind of commercial flights that would take the natives around to different far northern villages, and we started hopping those, and we got all the way over to Baffin Island, which is way on the eastern shore, and it's a big hunk of ice.
Yeah.
And then we managed to, in Baffin Island, we ran into this German couple, and the guy was like a big international lawyer and had a lot of money, and his wife was a watercolor painter, and so she wanted to paint the Arctic. And so they'd hired this little plane, this little Bush Arctic plane, to go up to Ellesmere Island. And, Ellesmere Island, like if you're going to the North Pole, that's your jumping off point. There's nowhere, there's no landmass farther. And so we hitchhiked. It took them a couple, several days to do all this. And we got up to Ellesmere Island. And then we hired the plane from the German couple, said, can we borrow it for like half a day? And they said, fine, we'll just stay here. And it's called Grise Fjord. It's like 10 houses on Ellesmere Island on the southern shore with a tundra strip. And so then we had this pilot, Jacques, who was like young guy retired from the Montreal Stock Exchange to be a Arctic bush pilot, and so Jacques says, okay, and I say, well, we want to go over there to Greenland. And, by that time, all these islands are getting squished together because you're getting so far up in the north.
You mean by like plate tectonics or just squished together by
the North Pole?
Yeah.
Everything, it all converges up there, And so the distance between this little landing strip in Grise Fiord, Canada, and the farthest north villages in the world, they're Inuit villages, Greenlandic Inuit villages, around a place called Qaanaaq. It's only 200 miles apart over open water. And so, Jacques was saying, yeah, I'll do that. Or, Jacques' boss said, yeah, you can do that. And Jacques was like, okay, I'll do it. And one of the problems was Jacques was a medical rescue plane. So it was used to landing on prepared airstrips. It had pretty small tires, landing wheels. And it was a fairly sleek plane. It wasn't one of those big, like, balloony bush planes. But it was still, it was pretty all-purpose. And so we get in. I'm spinning this story out. I could spin it for hours. But that, early in the morning, a beautiful sunny day like June, completely sunny, but everything, the sea's completely frozen. There are glaciers every which way. And we get in this plane, in Jacques' little plane, on this little tundra airstrip, and he taxis out to position, and I'm sitting in the front seat with him, and he on the earphones, and then it's like we're waiting for the control tower, and it's just go. and then we launch, and then we're flying over the incredible northern scenery, ice and islands and glaciers, and and this is pre-GPS. This is in 1990, 91, and so there were none of this high-tech computer or satellite tracking. And so Jacques has like an aeronautic map on his lap, and trying to find his way to Qaanaaq over there. And by now you're so far north that the magnetic compass points southwest.
And the declination is like about 180 degrees.
It's like almost exactly the opposite. And so we're flying north, and we're flying across this gap to a different continent, 200 miles of water, and after about a half an hour, we're driving along this, but it's beautiful weather, and Amy's in the back, and we have all our skis and stuff, crampons for Greenland, and Jacques has this map unfolded in his lap, and he says, at a certain point, he just kind of crumbles it up in a ball and shoves it in my lap. He says, I can't figure out where we are. See if you can. and then, anyway, eventually,
and that's a timed exercise at that point.
Right? That's right.
You're on the clock.
Yeah, we're on the clock. And the plus Greenland was clouded in, but he found a hole in the clouds. It was like it was very dramatic. And as we dropped through this hole in the clouds, you look down and there's this huge expanse of sea ice, a massive fjord, and I could see they look like little wagon trains running along. And I realized those are dog sleds.
Oh.
And they're way out on the sea ice. And so we circled around this little village, and Jacques was really nervous about landing. And, the airstrip's like a cliff at one side, a cemetery on the other, and it's all kind of lumpy. And so he's finally on the third try, just puts it down, and all of a sudden, crack, we go spinning down the runway, like fishtailing down because the landing gear breaks off when we land. And then, so now we're in Greenland. and so to make the long story short, we ended up hanging out with the Inuit hunters on the sea ice. And in this region of Greenland, they still hunt, I think still do, the traditional way with kayaks and harpoons. Snowmobiles are banned, literally banned.
Oh, no kidding.
And you'd be totally into this thing.
That's interesting. They got out ahead of that and just didn't want.
They got way ahead of it. Yeah. And I hope I'm really curious if it's still like that. And so we went out twice on 2 expeditions on the sea ice with hunters. One on a dog sled, and you have this sealskin kayak strapped to the dog sled, or 2 of them, and you get out there and you're hunting for narwhal, and they're out on the leads, the cracks in the ice, but way out, like 20 miles out before you get to where the ice starts cracking up. and then and we got stormed out of that one.
You didn't happen to get a tusk you're looking to unload, are you?
What?
You don't happen to have a narwhal tusk you're looking to get rid of.
No.
You didn't bring one home?
No. Almost, but I wasn't going to get in the kayak with a harpoon. Believe me, it's like you tip over in that kayak, and that's all she wrote.
Yeah.
And it's a wild scene, and then we got stormed out that time and had to kind of flee a storm to get back, dog sled back to the village, and then another time. A few weeks later, the ice had broken out, and we went out in boats and did the same thing. And our guys, they came close. They almost got a narwhal, but then, but not. And then we decided. Amy said, "Well, I really have to get back home now." She had, I can't remember. She had some hard deadline, and so we're almost at the North Pole, and we have to turn this whole expedition around to go home, which takes a month to get home. And the reason this story started is because when we were up there, and it's 4th of July, we're on the sea ice, we're in this dog sled, and it's a sunny day. Well, the other day it was a blizzardy day, but we have our full Montana ski gear on.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys, the Inuit hunters, are wearing Mamarut and another guy, Thomas, and they're wearing, really good veteran hunters. They're wearing light windbreakers, white, because that's, to disguise for camouflage, and thin, almost silk white gloves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all. And we're just dying of cold. And they're no problem.
Yeah.
And so when I got home, I started thinking, what is it about the physiology of cold? And then I came up with this idea for Outside Magazine to write about the physiology of cold. And I had this notion that I'd go out and camp out at Rogers Pass on the coldest night of the winter, at the coldest place in the lower 48 states, and see how that was, as a first-person experience for outside.
See how it was to get real cold.
Yeah, and then as it turned out that when that cold came along, that cold snap was 50 below with 50-mile-an-hour winds.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, I have a 2-year-old daughter at home, and I'm thinking, this might be a one-way camping trip. And so I called, you'll appreciate this. Mark Bryan was our editor at Outside.
Yeah.
And so I called Mark Bryan and I said, I don't think I'm going to do this. It's way too cold. And I said, well, how about if I just camp in the backyard? It's going to be 20 below. No, we don't want you to camp in the backyard. Why don't you invent a story of a guy who goes out in really cold weather and then goes through all the physiology of cold? And so that's what I ended up doing, and I wrote it in the second person voice, and I essentially stole the plot line from To Build a Fire.
I was just gonna guess.
Where else? And so the story, it has 100 different names. It's because it's been around 25 years, and it goes viral every winter in a cold snap. I think it's called Frozen Alive at this point.
Uh-huh.
But it's this really kind of eerie story about a guy who's trying to visit his friends at a mountain cabin on a winter night, and it's 20 below or something, and he's driving his Jeep up this winding road, and he spins off into a snowbank, and he's stuck, but he still wants to go to the cabin, and he has his cross-country skis, and he says, well, I'll just ski to the cabin. It's this beautiful moonlit night. It's only 5 miles or so. I run that far every morning before breakfast, and then you can imagine how it goes from there.
Ends up dead?
Not well. But I trace his physiology.
Sure, yeah.
That he gets up a certain point, and then the clip on his binding breaks, and he has to dig in the snow to find it. And now his body temperature is dropping from 95 down to 93, and at that point, brain function starts to slow down, and then at this point, kidney function starts to slow down, and it goes through the whole thing, and he does survive, but it ended up being this huge hit of a story.
I remember, man. Yeah,
and then so I thought, well, maybe I'll write a whole book like that. So I wrote a whole book called Last Breath. It's 11 great ways to die in the wilderness.
And I remember you did the box jelly.
Yes, the box jelly. Yeah.
Talk about that for a sec.
I was trying to find the most, poisonous, most toxic, most venomous creature, and it turned out to be the box jellyfish. You got any of you guys familiar with that? The box jellyfish?
I haven't seen one. I know it exists, but I've never,
seen one. Never been swimming with a box jellyfish.
No, we've gotten tangled up those little man of war, not little, those man of wars. Yeah, that hurts. And then the lion's mane ones hurt.
I've heard. I've never been in with those guys.
Like a box jelly. You know?
Well, in the box jellyfish, it's they say it's the size of like a grapefruit, but it has this incredibly powerful neurotoxin in it, and you can be dead in like 2 minutes with a box jellyfish. And it's and I traced all the chemistry of that. The setup was a couple on their honeymoon in northeastern Australia, and the guy takes a dive in the water, and they're sort of fighting, and the guy takes a dive in the water to sort of get away from her, and it's like,
and then what other ones?
He doesn't survive.
What other ones are in there?
Playfully splashes.
She dodged a bullet.
Was there a falling one?
Yeah, I had. Oh yeah, that was a fun one because I created a real jerk, and like a real type A hyper in your face jerk who was like, I'm the hottest rock climber there ever was. And he goes, he's going rock climbing one Saturday morning, and his buddy stands him up, so he says, I'll do it alone, and free climb it, and he gets part way up and he peels off, and he falls, I don't know, like 30 feet and lands on a ledge really hard, slam. And I don't know, do you know Doug Weber? He was an ER doctor in Missoula. He was the one who gave me this scenario because I was just going to have some guy like go tumbling down a steep slope and, flipping around. And he said, well, you can make that a lot more interesting because, when somebody takes a real fall, and it happens in car accidents too, it's like tragic stuff when it happens to somebody, that sudden deceleration can pull your heart forward, and it causes the aorta to have a weak spot in it, like a bubble. Now I'm spacing out the name for it, and that it's you can either break right then, or sometimes it kind of lasts for a while.
Are you feeling that right now, Steve, like you usually do?
Yeah, the phantom aortic pain.
I didn't cut to his camera, but he made a face.
Yeah. And
certain things I don't like hearing about.
And so, this guy, don't fall 30 feet on your back onto a ledge, and you're okay. But so this guy falls, and he really slams, and and then he kind of, Doug, the ER doc, said, and you typically throw up right then because this is your body, what it does, the physiology. And then the guy realized, well, he's still alive, He's didn't even really get knocked out too severely, but he has a broken leg. And so, and this guy's, I'm just painting him as the biggest asshole I can. And so he's up on this ledge and he lasts the night, and dawn comes and he thinks, I've got it, And also there's a thing in ER world called the golden hour. You probably heard of that. It's like the first hour after one of these really traumatic body impacts, accidents, that your body can kind of hold itself together for an hour. And they call it the golden hour. I mean, it doesn't always happen, but it can. So he gets past the golden hour and he lasts all night. And in the morning, he's like, I'm alive. And when he does that, he bursts his aortic bubble. And that's all she wrote.
This doesn't sound like it was any fun to write.
give a couple more that are in there. I remember. I'm trying to remember, man. I remember
there was I said in some.
Do you do hyperthermia?
Yeah, and that's what I said. I said in some notes that I sent to Corinne that out of that whole book, sometimes people ask me what do you think is the worst way to die in the outdoors? And I would say, oh God, none of them are good. And it's nobody wants any of those, and nobody wants any of those from anybody they know. But that I think hyperthermia would be the worst. So hypothermia, of course, is low body temperature. Hyperthermia is high body temperature, and that gets to a certain point where, and I realize how on the edge I'd been of that in certain moments. I used to run up Mount Jumbo every day in the height of the summer heat, and I could feel my body doing this weird shit.
Yeah.
And that it's really amazing how quickly you can go over the edge into a heat stroke or hyperthermia, and that it gets to a point where your body can no longer cool itself down. Like the mechanisms that you use to cool yourself down, like sweating and various other mechanisms, are overwhelmed. And at that point, your body actually starts heating up more, and it's like a nuclear furnace, reactor that's out of control, and then it gets really nasty. That your organs start perforating in various ways, and so you just start getting multiple organ failure, and it's just, it's really awful physiologically.
Who's that really promising young writer? I think Ian Fraser knew him as well, and he died of hyperthermia in Africa. Was his last name Shepherd or something?
I don't know. I'm not striking a bell. It's not striking a bell.
I feel like he was an outside writer too. And he died,
is that right?
He died of
Okay.
hyperthermia.
Well, I can believe it. And then, the one
There's
thing
like,
about
there's like a writing fellowship in his name now. Who the hell was that? He was a good writer, man. Try to find him. Shepherd, hyperthermia writer. I don't know, something like that.
But the one thing about it is that by the time all this really nasty stuff happens to your organs, you're unconscious. You don't know anything, and so you see it. That these unfortunate situations of people dying of heat stroke in athletic fields and whatnot.
Yeah,
they're out of it. And,
Yeah.
All right, what's your next book?
my next book. Well, see,
not what you're doing now. Tell me after
after that
Last
one.
Breath.
We're doing the speed. We're doing the speed dating.
Yeah, because then you did.
Then I did a story. Well, I did one called Last Empty Places. I went down the African River. That was a crazy book that's where I came to second close to dying
from a black mamba.
After your trip.
Wait.
After the trip. I thought I was going to die on the river, and once I got off the river, I was safe. But we were in a...
Yeah, and you guys got tangled up with like hippos.
Oh, yeah.
It would be real
hippos.
aggressive.
Yeah. Oh, and the waterfall, you just be buzzing around a bend. You have no idea what's around it. And there are, vines hanging everywhere. It looks like an African movie in fast water, and you're whipping around a bend. And that all of a sudden, like, our guide who'd never been there, but he was a really good whitewater kayaker, stopped like on this big boulder right in the middle of the river, and he says, "Stop here!" And you go whipping around the bend, stop right at his kayak, and you look over. Whoa! There's this big waterfall where you die instantly.
Yeah, it's like in every cartoon.
Yeah,
it's every cartoon.
Was there also quicksand?
And no. Yeah, well,
And a vine.
but like at night washing, you guys, I don't know if any of you have been in Africa, but you'd like washing the dishes beside the river at night. You'd always have to have a second person with a headlamp scanning, so the crocs, you'd see their red eyes come in, and if you tipped over in the kayak in the rapids, which happened to I think all of us several times, like when you're in the rapids, it's kind of like you're safe. Because the crocs don't like the rapids. They like the calm water below the rapids. So when you get washed out of the rapids, that's when you really have to get nervous. And that's when I said, this is as far as I'm going in my adventuring life. This is as far as I'm going.
That was the end.
Yeah, then that's when I said I'm going to write about historical guys doing the crazy stuff instead.
Yeah. But tell me about the Black Mamba.
Oh, the Black Mamba. Okay, so we'd been through, 15 days of this incredible, crazy stuff, and I would have quit and walked out if I could, but then I'd surely.
Was there a lot of fish in that river?
Not a lot.
Were the guys fishing?
No. We were just trying to. We're sort of surviving.
Moving.
Yeah. And there was no through the whole middle section. There were no people. I mean, there were no African villages. It was very remote and rugged, So after 15 days of this craziness, where I just thought I'd die every day, we finally get off the river, and we end up at this big, very remote, still huge remote game reserve called Niassa Reserve in northern Mozambique. And we connect with a hunting camp there that has like a hunting block on the border of this big reserve. And they're kind of taking us around. It's this really nice hunting camp. And they have a Land Rover, and it's the kind of Land Rover that there's no windshield, there are no doors. There's sort of a higher rack on the back where like the trackers will stand. And so he's like the great white hunter. Jamie is going to take us out to show us where he's going to do a leopard stakeout. And he's got to go set up the leopard stakeout during the day. And so the photographer and I get into this Land Rover and a bunch of trackers on the back, and we wind through this kind of open forest, and we get to the leopard stakeout, and he does his thing, and then we're driving like an hour back to camp, and I'm sitting in the left, it's British Drive, so I'm in the passenger seat on the left side, and there's no door, and Jamie has his 50 caliber. What are they? What's the 50 caliber elephant gun? The huge big
500 nitro maybe.
Yeah, it's maybe it's the 500. It's it's just the cannon that they use in Africa. So he has that mounted on his dashboard, and we had no guns at all going down this river. So it's like, wow, we even have guns to protect us now. Not to mention a Jeep and cars and iron, all this stuff. And we're driving back to camp, and we go into this open clearing with the sun coming down through the forest. And I remembered going through this clearing earlier because it looked kind of pretty. And then I noticed, like, wow, there's a big stick poking up in the middle of that clearing. I wonder how that happened because there's no wind. It couldn't have fallen out of a tree. And so Jamie is driving completely oblivious, and I'm looking at this thing, and he's going right towards it, or there's like two little tracks right next to it. And I'm looking at it, and then I notice that big stick is waving back and forth at like my head level. That high. Unbelievable. And he doesn't, he is completely oblivious. This all happens in just a few seconds at most. And I just say, oh shit. And I had nowhere to hide. I dove underneath the dashboard. Like really hard, slammed into all the metal down there. And then you hear this big kind of ka-wump on the Land Rover. And all the trackers go.
Struck the Land Rover.
They all say, Mamba, Mamba, Mamba. And so he stops the Land Rover, and all the trackers jump out. And at first they kind of go trying to chase the black mamba. I don't know what they were going to do with that. But then they go running around the Land Rover, and right in front of where my leg was, there are these two scratches down the paint.
Really?
Really, like a foot in front of my leg. And, down, it's like, that
His
Land
teeth
Rover
scratched the paint.
And these guys, these are serious African professional hunters. One's from Zimbabwe or Rhodesian, and the other was from South Africa. So they, this is their life. And they said, that the black mambas are extremely aggressive. They'll protect their territory against anything, and so it's not unusual that they'd strike at a Land Rover.
Is that the one they say, like, if you get bit by it, just go lean against a tree?
Yeah, that's the one.
There's no
and a couple of minutes.
There's nothing you're gonna do.
Yeah. The British, they have that British sense of humor. These kind of that dry, understated sense of humor. So Jamie says, after all this commotion, we get back, and I'm like, can I stand on the very top of the street, please? And rather than sit in the open front door, and he says, yes, in his British accent, like, yes, with a black mamba bite, your time to live is 20 minutes. And we do have some black mamba, antidote at our camp, but that's 45 minutes away.
That's hilarious. How'd you get interested in the Astorians?
I wrote a book called The Last Empty Places. Mm-hmm. And I profiled like 4 really unpopulated areas of the country. And the way I did it is I asked like a geospace geologist or a geographer, how do I find these real unpopulated areas? And he said, well, go get the NASA Landsat 7 satellite photo of the U.S. at night. And you look where the lights are, And then you go where they're not. And so that's what I did.
You're like, thanks for the tip.
Yeah, thanks for the tip.
I would have never thought of that.
And I spent hours and hours. It was really fun to study that. And I ended up
Like looking for the biggest holes.
I was looking for they call it my blank spots book.
Yeah.
And it's called The Last Empty Places. I wanted to call it the blank spots. But and I ended up choosing 2 in the east and 2 in the west. And one of the west ones was southwestern Oregon, where I'm sure some of you all here have been, which is really, really empty, so unpopulated and so huge. And I was driving out there. I think I had my falling apart Land Cruiser at that point. And
I remember that, Rick.
do you remember that? Yeah. You were around in those days. And it was still alive then, but not getting a lot of gas mileage. And I'm blasting through southeast Oregon, and it was getting dark. I'm doing research. I'm just checking it out, and it's like May, and it's getting dark, and I'm driving down this road, and it's like really getting darker and darker, and it's like I haven't seen a town for hours, and it's like where am I going to sleep? And I'm not even sure. I might have had camping gear, but it's like I don't want to go sleep in the ditch, and then. So then all of a sudden I come to this town called John Day, Oregon.
Yeah.
And so I find a motel, spend the night at John Day, Oregon. And then the next morning I say, John Day, that's a weird name for a town. And I look up, I start doing research on John Day, first on the internet. And then I think there was a little library there. And it turns out John Day is a member of this Astor Expedition. And he's this guy who's been gone through everything you can imagine. He's had malaria. He's poisoned himself by eating the death camas rather than the good camas. He's been left. He and another guy, when the Astoria Overland Expedition got caught in the middle of Hell's Canyon in winter, and they had no food, no way out. And
he
so
he got a river named after himself.
Yeah, he did get a river and a couple of dams.
He sounds
too.
like he would have been a good character to profile in your book about 10 ways to die in the wilderness.
He would have. He was helping me that book was helping me when I was writing about John Day. And he went through all this stuff, and then they left him behind, and the expedition left him for dead. And he and another guy managed to crawl out and find some Shoshone who, gave him some fox to eat, or some wolf, I think, actually. And then they survive, and they poison themselves with a death camas, and they crawl.
They just mis-ID purple camas.
Yeah. And then they eventually manage to crawl over the Blue Mountains to the Columbia. And so they get to the Columbia River, and they're thinking, we're saved, because all our guys are supposed to be building this fort at the mouth of the Columbia, but they're like a couple hundred miles upstream at this point. And so they're, but they think they're saved, and they're sitting on the riverbank on this nice sunny day, having survived all this stuff. And then suddenly they find themselves surrounded by Indians. And I can't remember which tribe they are. There are several tribes right in that area. And so the Indians are really kind of friendly at first and want to talk to them and whatnot. And then they have muskets and the Indians don't. And then, one of the Indians says, I want to see how long that musket is, and, wants to measure it. And, well, there goes that musket. And then another guy says, hey, I want to see that knife. Well, there goes that knife. And then another guy goes, I want to see that shirt. And so they ended up being completely stripped, utterly naked, and told to go back the way they came and don't come back.
The way they came?
Yeah, the way they came.
It's like, well, I was more thinking. It'll be you on your portage trip this year.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And then when they finally get to Astoria, this John Day, there's an expedition that immediately turns around and goes back overland to bring Mr. Astor letters in this tin box about, we made it there, blah, blah, blah. And this John Day, he's like, okay, I'm done with this. I want to go back. He's just like a really good Virginia hunter, and this good guy. He's like 40, this lanky guy, really good humor. And so they start going back up the Columbia in these, these big canoes. And then they're going to start trekking overland, and they get to a place where they run into the first tribe on the Columbia, friendly tribe. But John Day starts freaking out, and he goes completely crazy. He clearly has PTSD.
Yeah.
And then he tries to kill himself, 2 pistols to his head in the middle of the night. And he survives. But he
So it wasn't good at everything.
no, yeah, I guess not. But anyway, that was John Day, and so he was a guy who got me interested into the Astoria story. Yeah, he wasn't. He might not have been trying so hard. Who knows?
That's another check mark on the list of things he survived.
Yeah. Oh god.
He's
Yeah.
probably picture in the movie, and he's like, in the movie, when I got 2 pistols, that's gonna look badass. You know?
So anyway, that's how I got into
you
the
look extra deranged.
And then this, ends up being this. As I just got into it because I ran into this little town of John Day, and then the character John Day, and then the expedition itself, and it was just I learned it's like this massive expedition that I'd never heard of, and it had come 5 years after Lewis and Clark, sent by this huge fur baron in New York, fur and real estate baron John Jacob Astor, and he had this global trade scheme where he was sending one big party by ships around Cape Horn, establish a trade center at the mouth of the Columbia, another big party going overland to establish a series of posts going over the Rocky Mountains and meeting the seagoing party at the mouth of the Columbia.
But all based around the beaver market, right?
No,
were they
no,
interested
it
in
was a
gold?
sea otter.
Oh, there's
Sea
oh,
otter.
I see. So that was their
that's what-
coastal
yeah,
thing.
and at that point, the Northwest Coast there were a lot of sea otter,
Got you.
and it was Captain Cook's guys who discovered you could get a sea otter on Vancouver Island, a pelt, for like $1 worth of trinkets, and sell it for $100 in China.
Hampton Sides was just sitting where you're sitting
Is that right?
about the Captain Cook book,
Oh, is he? Okay.
which I read and which is phenomenal. And he talks about when some of those dudes when some of those guys who picked up a bunch of sea otter pelts in Alaska, they wound up like over in Siberia at one point.
Yeah,
And they were able to sell some of those. And I can't remember what expedition he was talking about, but he mentions there was guys that it was so lucrative. They hatched a plan, not Cook's guys, but these guys on his other boat hatched a plan to mutiny because they wanted to go back and get a bunch more of those things.
Yeah,
It was like that. It was like
that was that valuable.
That kind of money.
Incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredibly valuable. So that was Astor's scheme. It was like this brilliant global trade scheme. It was really visionary, and the idea was to have a fleet of ships, so it's literally continuously circling the world. And say that he was based in New York and Manhattan, and they'd leave New York and they'd have trade goods on them, in trade goods for the tribes like pots and knives and beads, trade beads, and they'd go around South America, around Cape Horn. They'd end up at the mouth of the Columbia at the Emporium, the trade emporium that he was building. And there they would trade their trade goods to the tribes, and there are a lot of tribes in the Northwest Coast, for sea otter furs. And then the ships with the sea otter furs would then go to Canton in China, and they'd sell those sea otter furs or trade them for huge markups. And they'd take on silk and tea and porcelain, which are really valuable trade goods in the Western world. And then they'd sail around the rest of the globe, around Africa, and they'd end up in London, and they'd sell the silk and porcelain and tea in London and also in New York, and make these huge profits at every stop, and have this fleet of ships continuously circling the globe.
Man, that reminds me of me recently leveraging a couple DSD turkey decoys into 2 big ribeyes. Grass-fed ribeyes.
That sounds pretty global.
But it mostly didn't work, right?
Well, it would have worked. I mean, there were various factors, and one is this is I wrote in some of these notes that it would be really, which we don't have time to do at least now, is talk about the birch bark canoe and what an incredible craft that was, and that the Brits in Canada had birch bark canoes, and they had the whole Voyageur trade route that could go all the way out to the West Coast by this time, really fast. Whereas the Americans had, it took them months and months and months. They're dragging barges up the Missouri River and, walking, and it's really slow. So the War of 1812 broke out in June of 1812. And so that's announced that Congress, U.S. Congress, President Madison declares war on Britain because the Brits are screwing with American commercial ships in the Atlantic and dragooning sailors off to go join the British Army and fight Napoleon. So there's all this hoorah about the U.S. is really pissed at Britain. So President Madison declares war. That's like mid-June of 1812. And the word of that, the news of that war, like in an actual formal declaration of war, immediately is launched through Montreal, out the Great Lakes, through Grand Portage, through all the lakes of that Manitoba, that whole area.
Meanwhile, John Day is going, oh, shit, we can't go down the snake. I have to turn around, walk all the way up this valley with no food.
Right. And so by this time that the Astorians had established a bunch of fur posts all in the Columbia Basin. And so they had this enterprise up and running. And then all of a sudden, one day, these Scottish fur traders, those are like the British honchos, Scottish fur traders show up at the northernmost Astor post and walk in the front door of the cabin and say, hey guys, we're at war with each other, and that means we're taking your fur posts. Which is what happens.
That's wild, man.
The other thing, that had to have been, a lot of reasons for PTSD.
Yeah.
I bring up turning around on the snake because that would be the thing in that whole deal that would give me PTSD. Hate being wrong and having to turn around. But the Russians were so established.
Yes.
Way established. With to the point of when you got out there after making that trip and be like, okay, we're going to establish this thing, this monumental scheme for transcontinental trade. You're like, oh, there's a literal world power that's been here for decades.
Well, they haven't been.
Right?
It's close. It's close. I mean, there are several world powers circling around this whole West Coast and the Pacific because it's kind of unclaimed territory. And the Russians had come over. They didn't establish their fur trade in Alaska until the late 1700s. And so this is what we're talking here is 1811. And but the Russians did have a major post.
Just up.
It's just what's the southernmost part? Is it Ketchikan?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the southeast Alaska?
That's the end of Alaska. Yeah.
So okay, so that's I'm pretty sure that's where they had it was like a stone castle, and he had he was living there like a baron. This guy Count Baranov, and so he's this really decadent Russian count. And it has all these Indians working for him, and I don't know, slave women, and he has military Russian military.
There's a Baranov Island, isn't it?
The ABC Islands Chillikov.
Yep.
Yeah, Baranov.
Admiralty.
Up that way. Yeah, so it's Count Baranov, and he's like this incredible drinker, and he has all these military guys with him too, and he has this big fur trade working with they Aleut in maybe they're
there's Tlingit there.
Yeah, I think he has several tribes working for him.
There was the Chugach to the north.
Yeah, but here's his big fur post, and so at one point, my guy, the guy who leads the Astoria Overland Expedition, Mr. Hunt, who's this real mild-mannered guy. He's from New Jersey. He'd never been in the wilderness before. He led the party across the country that got the continent that got everybody in trouble because he didn't know what he was doing. But he ends up taking a ship, and I think it has a bunch of sea otter pelts on it. And then he's going up to visit Count Baranov up at Baranov Island, and he's going to buy 25,000 beaver pelt from Count Baranov. And then he's going to take those over to Russia, Siberia, or China. And he's got this thing all worked out. And Astor's already sent his son-in-law and daughter to work out the diplomacy with the queen, with the Tsarina of Russia. So he's got all this stuff worked out. So Mr. Hunt sails his boat with his sea otter pelts from Astor's post up to Count Baranoff's post, and he's going to buy these 25,000 beaver pelts, and he's going to make a fortune for Mr. Astor. But so Count Baranoff is like, oh yeah, hey, why don't you stay a while, dude? We got some parties coming up, and I want to show you my military parade. And, let's have another drinking contest. And so it goes on like that for 3 weeks, but he can't get out. And he keeps saying, well, what about my beaver pelts? Oh, we'll get to that. And so by the time that the party's over, it's too late in the season to go across, to get the beaver pelts and go across to China. And so it's like Mr. Hunt is screwed. and Count Baranoff keeps his beaver pelts. And so it's a Russian ploy basically to keep Astor out of the.
It's like that Blues Brothers scene, where it's like, yeah, you guys get $50 for the concert, but you drank $75 worth of beer. So.
Yeah, when the Good Old Boys, the band called the Good Old Boys was late for their show. It's a great reference. That puts it into perspective for people. When that was called the Astorians.
It was called Astoria.
And
then the subtitle is John Jacob Astor and Thomas Jefferson's Lost Pacific Empire.
Got it.
So that was a fun, crazy book to write.
So hit me with getting into George Washington.
Well, so that every book I've written in the last 4 or 5 books came from that Last Empty Places book.
Oh, okay. Well, you know what? I got to tell you something. I wanted to tell you earlier. You're talking about winding up at the John Day Hotel, or winding up in John Day at a hotel. Yeah. I took my wife one time on a research trip. We went out in Bismarck, North Dakota, and there was if I remember right, man, I think it was there was a big, all the Seventh-day Adventist churches were having some kind of conference. If I remember that, that's what it was. I think I remember. Either way, you couldn't find anything.
And no place to stay.
No place to stay, and I didn't make any plan. And we find a motel. I'm not joking. I wish my wife could come down and tell the story. We find a motel where literally letters in the motel neon are burned out. We pull in. It's a dirt driveway. We pull in, and a guy comes out, to greet us. Like before we can even get out of the car, he comes out to greet us, and I roll down the window. So I'm like, oh, who's this? It must be the proprietor. I roll down the window, and he pokes his head in and goes, how many of you are in there? We get this room, and there is no joke, a prophylactic on the floor of the room. And cigarette butts.
These aren't the Seventh-day Adventists.
No. This is the only room left, the only place left. And my wife's like, I am your future wife, and you would have me stay. So from then on, yeah. When you go on research trips, call ahead. Advice for future writers.
If you have your spouse along, make arrangements ahead of time.
That would have been so good, though, to keep referencing that in the, my past wife stayed in the room like this. You know what my past wife would have done.
So that's why this the Blank Spots book, the Last Empty Places. One of the places I profiled was Western Pennsylvania, which is, it's amazingly dark on the.
Is that right?
Yeah, amazingly dark. And it's like the biggest, darkest area in the east near an urban area that I could find. And
where were we at in
if you went to Pittsburgh and went somewhat northeast of there, do you know that territory?
I grew up in Edinboro, so not far from where you were from.
Okay, so it's all national forests and it's mountains and it's not agricultural land. It was given away as bounty lands after the Revolutionary War and the War of French and Indian War, and there was nothing good out there. So the soldiers who got this land said it's not worth anything, and so they kind of walked away from it. But so I was out in that blank spot doing research. I was like, that was 2007 or something. And I ran into this 22-year-old guy stumbling around in the woods out there who was really screwing up. And he's this real jerk, and his name was young George Washington. And that's where he kind of cut his teeth in the wilderness. And so I said, wow, this guy's a really interesting character. And so then I decided to write a book about him.
Yeah. That stuff, that like aspects of his life. I only found out about that because I was on this thing. You ever hear the Warrior's Path? It's just like one of the. Basically, it's one of those trails. Part of this trail.
The Great Warrior. Yes, I do. I know it. Yeah, I know it well. Yeah.
Yeah, I read something about Washington, but this is post Revolution.
Okay.
He had a bunch more land claims there from having served his duty.
That's where he bought his first land at age 18, right along there.
Okay. He had went out to take a look at. He's got so much land he hadn't even taken a look at it yet.
Right.
Went out to take a look and got lost. In his journal, he describes getting lost. And I met this old timer down there in the Panhandle of Maryland, he went and showed me. You know how you can go to places in the Oregon Trail where it's not like there's no road overlaying it, and you can see the ruts. He took me out and there's like big ass oak tree and a bunch of farmland and stuff. And we go out and there's a big oak tree, and he lived there and grew up there and read all the stuff. He's like, yeah, that trail was here. Do you know what I mean? And you could still kind of picture it.
Was it the Great Warriors Road or was it the Braddock Road? Do you know what? The Braddock Road.
Well, I think it was part. Yeah, well, wasn't all the same complex roads?
No, the Braddock Road went from like the head of the Potomac, not the head of the Potomac, but from like Arlington, Virginia, right near Washington, D.C., over the Allegheny Mountains to Pittsburgh. And that was built by General Braddock, who was in the French and Indian
Braddock,
War.
He was
the guy who got slaughtered out there. Yeah.
But no, man, because it was like
but it could have been, because you know why?
It was in Maryland, though.
That could be because
Morgantown.
I know where you're talking. That's a cool place. The Panhandle,
whatever the hell road it is.
But I think it was what you're talking about. I think is the Great Warriors Road, which was used by the tribes. Like I think it was like Catawba in the Great up in the near the Great Lakes, and they had mortal enemies down in the southeast, and so these tribes would go up and down that road to that path when they would fight each other. Yep. And so it became known as the Great Warrior Road. And then when settlers first came there, they became known as the Great Wagon Road. So it was down the middle of the Allegheny the Allegheny Valley. Okay. Or that's the Allegheny, the Shenandoah Valley. Yes.
Anyhow, he took me and said, you can pretty much...
You see the ruts.
Yeah, he's like, it's reasonable to assume that Washington rode his horse to the right of that oak tree.
Totally. Wow. Yeah, that would be totally. I mean, that would be totally right. Yeah. That would be totally right.
And got lost hereabouts.
That's awesome.
So that book's called Young Washington. How wilderness and war forged the founding father.
Yeah, we get into in our Long Hunters piece, that the audio original I was telling you about. We get into Washington being there for Braddock's defeat as some sort of informal advisor,
right?
In the way that the way that battle wound up sort of changing wilderness warfare,
and also that it changed. It was one of the pivotal moments of his life because every other officer virtually was killed, and he survived, and he had bullets through his coat, and his horse was shot out from under him, and that after that that was almost kind of one of the key pivotal moments that turned him from being this self-centered guy who's really ambitious and trying to be a British royal officer and whatnot into someone who was kind of thinking about a larger picture, because after that battle, and he survived and so many other officers were killed, he said, well, Providence, he wrote this in a letter to his brother, Providence must be saving me for some larger purpose. Now, there's a footnote to that.
And not land grabbing.
Well, that could be part of that on the side. You have to have a backup plan, right? But you know what's really occurred to me, and you guys would find this way interesting, because I've studied a lot of these battles, especially in the East, these early Indian warfare, the Northwest Indian Wars and French and Indian War. But in that battle, Braddock's defeat, Washington he wanted to be a British Royal Army officer, and they wouldn't let him in. I mean, he didn't have much of an education. He was kind of crude. He'd already really screwed up in a causing his own massacre early in the going, and so they wouldn't let him in as a guy. They wouldn't let him wear a red coat and gold braids, and so he was wearing like civilian clothes or hunter's clothes during Braddock's defeat. And so, who do you think the Indians shoot first?
Sure, man.
They
red.
take out the officers, and so all the officers got mowed down almost instantly. But Washington didn't really show up on their radar screen, and so that in my theory, that's one of the main reasons he survived. He was incredibly brave. I mean, no doubt about it. And his whole life, incredible bravery.
We in the Long Hunters, we mentioned this connection that Boone was there that day.
Yeah. He took off with his wagon.
He was a teamster. So we mentioned it like Boone, even though Washington was later critical of frontiersmen like Boone, Boone would have been aware. He would have been aware of Washington. Almost certainly, he would have been aware of him.
Of his presence.
And would have seen him.
Yes.
And conversely, Washington would have zero idea who Boone was.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly
when you look
right.
at the hierarchy of the people
there
that day.
And Washington was literally attached to General Braddock's camp. So he would have, their meals would be served in the general's, meal tent. And they have like sterling silver platters going on here. and it's, it's not what Daniel Boone was eating off of.
No.
He had a Bowie knife would be his version of his sterling silver. And I think, if I remember, Boone was like 17 or 18 or maybe 19 at most.
Young.
And Washington would have been in his early 20s, 23 maybe. And so I don't think Boone was anywhere near that corps of officers, other than knowing who they are. And Washington would. Well, there's like a muleteer back there.
Sure, yeah, one of many.
But Boone, to his credit, could see the writing on the wall right away. and
boogied.
It boogied.
Real quick, so I can see how this leads in, but really quickly hit us with your book about Tecumseh.
Tecumseh.
Because that winds up like, that's very tied to this, because
exactly.
One of the things you see, you look at the French and Indian War, the Revolution, the War of 1812, you wouldn't have perceived it, if you were alive then, you wouldn't have perceived these as distinct.
No.
Do you know what I mean? It was the great European powers, right? It was like the great European powers jockeying for influence.
That's exactly
and then
right,
using tribes as proxy forces.
That's exactly right.
And it would have just seemed like someone involved in the Cold War would have been Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan. Like all this stuff would have sort of bled into this broader thing against Soviet influence.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And you'd be like, well, yeah, there's this and this and this, but it's part of this broader story of the West. Like
for sure, yes.
Capitalism and communism.
That West. I mean, both the American West and the West.
The West mean West. The global West.
The global West.
But all these, a lot of what we're talking about here is sort of these like all conflicts. I mean, they all like bleed into one another, and players overlap.
Oh, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? Like like Washington was a player in French and Indian War, and very involved in the Revolution, and then people that were very involved in the Revolution were War of 1812, right? And then they enter the political sphere.
No, that's exactly right, and that's sort of what I've been fascinated with for some years now, and writing about just that period that you're talking about, and actually Astoria is part of it, because it's the West Coast projection of empire, and you have in Astoria you have the Russians, you have the French, you have the British, you have the Americans, and you have the Spanish all vying for the West Coast at the same time, right around the year 1800. In the east of the continent, when you start out in like 1790, the white settlement, it barely goes to the Appalachian Mountains. I mean, it's trickled over a little bit, but barely. And so there's all that land out there that's a no man's land in terms of of European empires. Of course, it's tribal land, and there's a whole dynamic that's gone on for centuries among the tribes. But that land, I mean, not only in the 1790s, but in the decades before that, was, in a way, I think I describe it, that Ohio Valley land, it became a storm center of the world, where these empires ended up conflicting with each other and essentially fighting it out. And as you say, using the tribes as proxies. And one of the things I really emphasize when I talk about this is that in these years, in 1790s, 1800, 1812, I mean, right up to then, nobody knew what the U.S. was going to be. I mean, nobody knew if it was going to survive. No one knew if it was like an experiment. And because I've gone into this stuff so deeply and really read records of Congress when they're arguing about all this stuff. It's some of these frontier issues and some of these like other issues, but it's like I think of it as have you ever built with framed something? You used to be a framing guy.
No, I've done some. I can't lay claim to that. I was a tree man.
I know you did closet work at one point.
Yeah, I did that.
But that's not framing. That's true. Yeah. But okay, well, if you think
like cabinet stuff and but not.
Okay, but think of like
I don't want to have that that crown on my head as a framing man.
Okay. Well,
I'd be surprised if Cal was a framing man.
Oh yeah, I can rattle off a list of places that are still standing proudly in Missoula.
Okay. Now imagine you built that place out of green uncured wood and rough sawn, completely green, and you hammered together this frame, and you kind of tack it in with the nails like halfway in and make this sort of structure. Well, that's the way the United States was in 1790.
That's also a lot of my projects resemble that.
That's great.
I mean, literally, that's the total image that comes to mind. And so much hadn't been worked out. And one of the and I could go all day and night about it, but that one of the things that really wasn't clear is like how far west the U.S. was going to go. So it was not a done deal that the U.S. was going to go even past the Appalachians or even to the Mississippi or no way to the West Coast.
Yeah.
And so the British were really, their literal plan was to create what was called an Indian barrier state, which would have been a no man's land, a neutral territory where imperial powers in the U.S. had no control, that would be a strip of land, essentially the Ohio and Mississippi Valley, that whole all the way from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico.
Tribal land, and it would be controlled by the tribes, and the Brits and Americans were free to trade there, in this sort of controlled way. But that's the Brits. They made at several different points a push for what they called the Indian barrier state. In a way, it would be like not in a way, it was literally trying to bottle up the little fledgling baby United States, to bottle it up on the East Coast, so it didn't come over the Appalachian Mountains and didn't screw around with British holdings in the interior of the continent. Didn't screw around with a really valuable fur trade that was out farther west, and so in this era, we're talking about a country that didn't really know how it was going to fully function, and it didn't know what size it was, how far it would go. So the battles that we're talking about, this whole era, it's, as you're saying, it's all part of that arc. It's all part of that piece, and it's like working it out. Tell the title of the Tecumseh book.
It's called "Gallop Toward the Sun: Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation."
And that was, I guess you could put so Tecumseh was a war leader who had a prophet brother.
Yes.
And they put an idea of, instead of tribes interfighting, instead of like internecine conflict, they would unite all the tribes and push America back into the ocean.
Well, yeah, or at least stop it from pushing them into the ocean.
Yeah.
And it wasn't so much about stopping internecine conflict. It was about agreeing to hold the land as one entity. So what was happening is that the federal agents would approach one tribe or one sub-chief of one tribe and try to pry, land or some kind of agreement out of that chief who might actually be selling some other tribe's land hundreds of miles away. So it was like always splitting.
Yeah, that was a common thing. A guy would be like, "Sure, I'll sell that to you."
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Iroquois sold all of Kentucky to the Brits, the Iroquois.
But it wasn't theirs.
And the Iroquois were 700 miles away when they signed a contract. Yeah, you can have all that land down there. The Cherokees think it's theirs, but no, we know it's not theirs. That's exactly what happened.
We got to wrap up.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many fun things to talk about.
No, there's a ton of fun things to talk about. But give the name of the Tecumseh book again. People like this a lot.
It's called Gallop Toward the Sun, Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation.
I'll say this. You read all Peter's books, you're going to dominate MeatEater trivia.
A few answers we've alluded to them today from past trivia.
A lot of times he says stuff, and I've been like, that was a trivia question. All right, Peter Stark, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, really fun to talk to you, Steve, and all the rest of you. Thanks so much for having me.
We'll have to have you back on to get
anytime. Let me know.
Yeah, the well is deep.
Well, until it dries up. But
all right, thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, there's nobody better than Steve Rinella. Guy can go on and on forever just talking about squirrels and asking about nicotine. And there's nobody better than Giannis Patelis, an eagle-eyed cougar killing Lavian Menace bird. Talk about his mama, you'll see a flash before your eyes. And there's nobody better than my good pal Chester. Guy can turn a dollar to a dime in an hour by just making a few minor investments. And there's nobody better than a man named Spencer. Guy got a tree tattooed on him forever, but please don't hold it against him. It's just something about that MeatEater crew that keeps me tuning in for an hour or two. Maybe it's just a really good damn show. Maybe it's how much the boys all love to act like they know. But either way, I wanna give them a Michigan hello.